Us this more now with the Senior Director of Law, Policy and Research at Outright International, Neela Ghoshal, who's joining us now virtually from Washington, D.C. in the United States. Neela, welcome to today here on eNCA. Thank you very much for joining us. I mean, there has been outrage in many parts of the world, including on our continent, and outcry, rather, about this anti-gay law that's now come into effect in Uganda. What's the reaction been like in your neck of woods?
Well, in my neck of the woods, and thank you for having me on the show, first of all, to discuss this, I'm in contact with LGBTIQ activists in Uganda, as well as around the world, that, as you've said, are outraged, and in the case of those in Uganda, are terrified that this law has now been enacted. And Outright has clarified that, in our opinion, this law is nothing short of genocidal ideology. This law seeks the extermination of LGBTIQ people. In the clip that you just played, the Member of Parliament, Asuman Basulira, was speaking of capital punishment for forced sexual acts, which is a misrepresentation of the law. The law also puts people to death for consensual same-sex acts. In addition to actually putting people to death for consensual same-sex acts, the law puts in place provisions that make it impossible for LGBTIQ people to access housing or healthcare. And if you can't have a home and you can't access healthcare and you're HIV positive and you can't access ART, this is also a path to death. And so essentially the Ugandan government is celebrating the murder of LGBTIQ people. And this is absolutely outrageous. It should be condemned. Uganda has essentially made itself a pariah state, and business as usual with Uganda has got to be put to a stop.
And you say you've been speaking to LGBTQI+ activists on the ground in Uganda, and they are very fearful. Are you aware if they are planning to take any action, like appeal in a court of law against this new law?
Yes, in fact, what I've always found impressive about LGBTIQ activists in Uganda, and I've been working with them for about 15 years, is that despite the pressure that they're under, it's an extremely resilient activist community. And so they have immediately filed an appeal. That has already been filed. The appeal challenges the constitutionality of the law. And the appeal also calls for an injunction on the enforcement of the law. So if Uganda's constitutional court correctly analyzes its constitutional obligations, it should agree to an injunction of the law. But of course, we don't know that. We don't know whether the court will follow its obligations or not. In the past, this court has at times done the right thing and at times been highly politicized and acted under political pressure from President Museveni and others. So what we're hoping for is an injunction followed by a ruling that the law is unconstitutional, which is very clear.
Yeah, I mean, the MP that we had speak a little bit earlier, that's Asuman Basulira, as you said, he sponsored this bill. He was saying that as a reaction from the rest of the world, they're expecting aid to Uganda to be cut. And that already, apparently, there's been some US visas being revoked. You are in Washington. What kind of action has the American government, because they're a close ally of Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, what kind of action are they contemplating and taking to force Uganda to change this law?
Yes, and organizations like Outright and other human rights organizations that are based in the United States have long called on the United States government to question that close partnership with Uganda and with President Museveni, not only on the grounds of Uganda's mistreatment of LGBTIQ people, but also on a whole range of human rights abuses, corruption, etc. So the US is aware of these abuses, and there was a very strong statement from President Biden yesterday regarding both the anti-homosexuality law, but also the overarching atmosphere of human rights violations and corruption in Uganda, and indicating that the US is prepared to act. And so visa sanctions are certainly one possibility. There are a number of provisions under US law in which those responsible for grave human rights violations and persecution can be denied visas to enter the United States. There are also benefits for Uganda, like the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, which is a beneficial trade preference that's given to a number of countries that are US allies. Currently, Uganda benefits from AGOA status, so it accesses certain trade preferences. And the Biden administration has made clear that AGOA status depends on not committing gross human rights violations. And so that's certainly something else that the United States is looking into. With regard to aid to Uganda, activists on the ground in Uganda who are part of a coalition called the Convening for Equality, which is major LGBTIQ groups and other human rights groups in Uganda, have called for development partners to put on hold direct aid to the Ugandan government and instead try to direct that aid as much as possible to the nonprofit sector. Because right now, funding the Ugandan government is funding persecution. And so there's a very clear call from activists that funding needs to be reconsidered, rethought, packaged differently, and given to different recipients so that Ugandans can get aid without that aid passing through the government. One of the things that's most appalling about the reaction to this bill in Uganda is that the Minister of Health herself, Jane Acheng, who's responsible for upholding the health of all Ugandan people, has celebrated the passage of this bill. And it is very hard for development partners to continue working on an equitable health response with a Ministry of Health that's celebrating the extermination of LGBTIQ people. So I think that certainly from the United States and from all around the world, including in South Africa, that relationships with Uganda, including assistance, will be questioned.
Very interesting time ahead indeed for Uganda. Neela, just a question around some of the implications of this law. I've seen reports from different parts of the world, including on our continent here, saying this kind of law has a potential to undermine all efforts against certain campaigns of health campaigns like HIV/AIDS.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The HIV/AIDS response depends on reaching all populations that are susceptible to HIV/AIDS without stigma and without discrimination. And major funders in the HIV sector, like the Global Fund and PEPFAR, have specific programs targeting key populations, which are groups that are vulnerable to HIV/AIDS, including men who have sex with men. Those organizations' principles depend on being able to distribute that aid without discrimination. Now, the law in Uganda essentially says that anybody who is LGBTIQ needs to be reported to the authorities and that no organization can promote homosexuality. So and no organization can normalize homosexuality. And so offering services in a non-discriminatory manner could now be in violation of Ugandan laws. So it will be very, very difficult for the HIV/AIDS response to continue in Uganda, which is really a shame because going back to the beginning of the HIV crisis on the continent, Uganda was initially one of the countries that was furthest ahead in its response in trying to focus on destigmatizing HIV and providing response without discrimination. And now the country is going backwards. And the reality, the impact of this is that more people will acquire HIV and that more people will not get services and that they will die.
Thank you very much for your time and insights this afternoon, South African time. Neela Ghoshal, Senior Director of Law, Policy and Research at Outright International, talking to us from Washington, D.C. Reaction to this new draconian law that's been passed in Uganda.